I want to welcome you once again to There's Always a Way podcast. And as our tradition has been, I say that like we've been doing this for 20 years, but we haven't. But in these months, our format has been for me to share with you visionaries and authors and pastors and executives and scientists and musicians, all different kind of backgrounds, but those that have really meant a lot to me. And by that, I mean, they motivate me. They've caused me to think about things differently, and they've influenced the way I do ministry. And I want you to know, the longer you're in ministry, the more you want to dine at the table of young thinkers. So I'm pumped whenever we get, Jordan, you've been in ministry almost 20 years now, or 20 plus years. So I know it takes an old dude like me, still unbelievably cool, but that's obvious. But anyway, but I've watched you from teenage years, an incredible family, father, a godly, highly successful pastor and educator, and just an incredible individual. So getting to watch you morph into now, having been at some of the most exciting and some of the most influential churches in the nation, each one of them is different as night and day, and then watching you going to a college town and becoming the senior pastor after all those years in youth ministry, and then now what's going on at First Cleveland has got, created quite a buzz. There's a lot of folks watching and excited and trying to lean in and learn from, because that's a church in transition, a church that did a lot of things right, incredible heritage, some significant pastors, especially a pastor been there for a long time, very beloved. And here comes this young visionary. So we got a lot to cover. But Jordan, as we always begin, this is Jordan Easley. And Jordan, thank you for being on There's Always a Way podcast with us today.
Thanks, Jake. It's an honor, man. It's an honor to be a part of your podcast, and it's always an honor just to have a conversation with a hero, man.
Well, you're incredibly gracious, and this will ensure you being on another 12 times in the next 3 weeks. No, but anyway, thank you for that. Jordan, what's the first thing with your background? You really do have carved out a niche as a future tense thinker, someone thinking about, yes, we have these fundamentals we believe in. Yes, we believe the Bible is, the greatest leadership book ever written, but it's God's word. But so you've got all that tradition and heritage, but yet you're a thinker. You're always thinking about tomorrow. So I'm interested in, what's the first thing pops into your mind based on all your experiences when you hear the phrase or read the phrase, there's always a way?
That's a great question. When I think about the fact that there's always a way, I think I automatically go to Romans chapter 12, where it talks about don't be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I think God gives us a mind, and He wants us to reimagine our situations. A lot of times, I think about circumstantial leadership and how sometimes the circumstances of the day prevent leaders from moving forward or from being maximized. And yet I'm reminded that by renewing our mind and looking at things through a different lens, it allows us to adapt our thinking and our methodology in order to be maximized for the kingdom of God. And I think really 2020 was a great year to demonstrate just that. There were a lot of people who, man, they heard pandemic and they heard this virus is coming to the United States, and they decided that they weren't going to treat it like a snow day, and they weren't going to just take a vacation and camp out for a little bit and wait for this thing to blow over. But they said, okay, how can we accomplish our same goals by taking a different path? And by reimagining the pathway to accomplishing our goals and really to accomplishing the mission of God, I think as leaders, it gave us an opportunity to really live out Romans chapter 12, verse 2, and to demonstrate what it looks like to lead in a different way. Because you're right, man, there's always a way. There is no circumstance so great that's going to prevent you as a leader from accomplishing God's vision or mission for your life.
Well, Jordan, I've always believed, I learned it, one of the first, I came to the dance late. I was a teenager, senior year in high school, before I ever even heard John 3:16. But one of the very first lessons I learned after experiencing the power of the Lord and him coming into my life was that if God be for me, who or what can stand against me? And
Right.
so therefore I need to operate with confident, not humility, in maybe trying to make sure I got a good light as I navigate, around the corner, looking around the corner. But yet, if he's for me, who in the world could be against me? And
Hmm.
it's exciting to see the churches that have actually not just hung on white knuckled and survived, but have actually been thriving. And by a lot of spiritual, I'm not just talking about the number of views or the number of people following us, but I'm talking about those that are growing and their commitment and faithful in their giving and taking advantages of outreaches on reaching out to friends and neighbors and family so they too could hear the message that could change their lives. So I love that. I love that definition. And you're one of those churches that have thrived and not just merely survived. And that's pretty amazing. I know you got some wacky things. You're you're a volunteer fan. Is that still true? I mean, you seriously. I mean, I
Listen,
know when
when,
there's got to be a time we put away childish things and we step up and realize that's. I mean, are you still a vol?
when in Rome, Jay, I was born and raised in Texas, and so I've always been a Dallas Cowboys fan. So I'm used to cheering for a losing team. And
All right, don't be. Now you
I'm
started out strong, but then the wheels got wobbly.
You have to amen that. As a Cowboys fan, it's a very disappointing and heart-wrenching thing.
Oh, it is to not be the talk of the town as America's team and to not keep the. I'd like some shiny trophies. I like the rings we got, but I want one of them shiny ones. One of those for today. The Well, Jordan, I'm a Florida Gator, so I just wanted to get that out there. And we love Tennessee, by the way.
I know
And
you
what's that
do.
song that y'all play? And whenever what is the theme? Isn't there a song that everybody?
Why do we let's not talk about this right now. Let's talk about
Okay,
something better than this.
okay. I was setting you up, and you're too smart to go through it. It's too late. Don't pull down some memorabilia.
I'll
Okay,
drink.
now,
I'll just drink. I'll drink out
okay.
of my Tebow cup for you,
No,
buddy.
I hear
But
you. Well, I got Tim's Southeast Conference championship jersey of the championship
wow,
game. And a bunch of youth pastors were in my home, and I had a stack on my pool table, and I hadn't gotten them all. It costs a lot and takes a lot of room to frame, and display. And I had a bunch of jerseys there, and one of them was Tim Tebow's. And this youth pastor found out it was from the SEC championship game signed by Tim. And he goes, "Man, Doc, wouldn't it have been great if you got the national championship jersey?" I said, "Son, where are you from?" He said, "Oklahoma." I said, "Look, listen to me. The SEC championship game is the
oh,
national champion." So
that
anyway, I thought you'd enjoy that. I know you just had Tim there. How did that go?
was a great event, man. Tim's such a humble leader and did a great job of just connecting with our people and communicating the gospel. It was a great event. We had a lot of people here, a lot of decisions for Christ made. We appreciate his willingness to use his voice for the kingdom for sure.
Man, I'm looking down at the resume here, man. You have served as a student pastor at Second Baptist in Houston. Uh, I think they've got today at some 9 campuses, maybe 10 now, but one of the most visionary pastors and exciting leadership. I think they call it the Fellowship of Excitement, if my memory is right.
Sure
And
do, yeah.
so you were there under Dr. Ed Young. You were at Prestonwood under Dr. Jack Graham, and those two men are two of my closest friends. So I'm fans of what incredible churches. In fact, I just had the privilege of speaking at both back to back in November. So that was a pretty cool time. But you've also went though to First Atlanta, and Dr. Charles Stanley is a beloved Bible teacher and pastor and been a leader in many, many ways. His ministry has touched millions, but yet it's a much older situation, more established situation. So I've got to ask you, Jordan, as a young man, uh, full of fire and passion, and you go to a city like Atlanta, where you got folks from everywhere, all colors, all backgrounds, all income. I mean, you name it. Atlanta is the kind of that melting pot, if you would. So, what was it like to try to reach all those groups in a very traditional church?
It was hard. I'm not even going to lie to you. I mean, that was probably the most challenging season of ministry that I ever experienced. Not because of Dr. Stanley, but because of the culture of the church and really the climate that we found ourselves in those weird years. And so it was right before the collapse. The economy was collapsing. You know, it was like 2005, 2007.
Mm,
Um, and I honestly, looking back, it's very clear why God sent us there. It was to educate me and to prepare me for
mm,
future ministry. And also, you know, Dr. Stanley, he, for some reason, as a young man, took me under his wing and I traveled with him. And he
right.
gave me opportunities to preach before anybody else. And man, I'd preach on Sunday and then we would spend all day on Monday with him just ripping me apart and teaching me, how to do things differently and how to phrase things more appropriately. And so he was a coach for me, a behind the
Wow.
scenes coach, a mentor, a friend. He taught me how to pray. Every Monday, we spent about 30 minutes on our knees together in his office, just he and I praying for the week. And he taught me a lot about leadership. He also connected me with his son, who was a huge benefit to me in those early years. I would spend time with Andy at Cracker Barrel, and he would say, "Come with 3 questions," and I could ask him anything, and he would just coach me up over an omelet. And just looking back at some of those conversations, they were
Wow.
pivotal in my
Sure.
life. And just the leaders, the men who God has allowed me to walk alongside every season has been such a benefit to me. And easy seasons, hard seasons, man, looking back, they're all so incredible, and we're a huge part of creating really the person I am today and the pastor that God's allowed me to be.
You've always been a part of significant growth. I know, we live in a day and age where everything is measured. We want to measure everything. But I'm one of those that have never really minded that. I believe, I like to know if I'm getting closer to my destination. I don't mind getting constant, hey, you're only 40 miles away, you're 20 miles away from wherever I may be headed. Uh, I like knowing, man, you're making good time. I like knowing that others that care about people, especially trying to reach and keep a generation, that whenever there's really great favor, the wind is blowing and the Lord is using what we do, those are mighty exciting times. What did you learn about how do you go into a situation where maybe the wind isn't already blowing? What should you do? And we have a lot of youth pastors that listen to these podcasts, and certainly you've been in almost every situation imaginable. What do you say? What do you do while you're waiting for the wind to blow or the fire to fall? Whatever analogy you like to use.
I've entered into new seasons in ministry where things are rocking and rolling already, and I've walked into ministries that are stagnant. And the crazy thing about it, Jay, I would say that me as a person, I didn't change or necessarily adapt who I was or the way that I did ministry going into those situations. I would say that if you were to define who I am as a minister, as a leader, I'm a great commission guy. I believe in action. I think that we all should be evangelists. I think we should all make disciples. I believe that that's what God has called us to do. If you're not fishing for people, you're not living out the Great Commission. And so a lot of people, they put that stamp on me and just say, well, he's just an evangelism guy, as if that's a negative thing. I am. I love seeing people saved. I'm going to preach the gospel every chance I get. I've seen people respond to that invitation and accept
Mm.
Christ. And then it's our job to equip them for the work of ministry so that they too can go lead people to the Lord. And so that's been my strategy. That's been my mindset. That's who I am. And I've had the privilege of seeing God really use that and bless that in incredible ways. Because as the leader, maybe you're not the senior pastor, maybe you're the youth pastor, the high school, middle school pastor, but as the leader of people, your passion is going to trickle down to your people. And so I've just had the opportunity to see that when I put an emphasis on the Great Commission, when I put an emphasis on being a strategic leader and actually having a target to shoot at in ministry, that my people, it's contagious for them. They see my passion and they say, okay, let's roll. Let's do what this guy is leading us to do. Jesus started the whole thing. He's the one who told us what to do. He gave us the game plan. But now, as a leader, it's our job to live out that game plan. And so, man, I'm a big fan of vision, and I don't think it needs to be vision outside of the Holy Spirit. I think the Holy Spirit gives us vision. I mean, it's Proverbs 29:18 that says, without that vision, people are going to perish, right?
Mm.
That ought to be a huge warning to us as leaders that if we don't have a vision from the Lord, we're not in a position to lead people to the Lord. And so I believe that it begins with hearing from the Lord, walking in the Spirit, and then being prepared to prioritize the things Jesus tells us to prioritize, to fish for people, to make disciples, and to meet people at their points of need.
Well, Jordan, you're shattering some pre preconceived notions that people have of younger, dynamic, uh, eloquent, fiery young leaders. They think it's all going to be about the newest and the latest, and yet all I've been hearing you talk about are the fundamentals, the basics, a life that's overflowing with enthusiasm and gratitude for the Lord. So I'm grateful for you shattering some of those preconceived notions. And another reason why we need to listen to what young thinkers, young men and young women, what burdens them, what are they concerned about, and what is it they see, because they love the church and love the Lord as much as us old guys, but what do they see? Man, I wish the church would do this, or I wish the church would respond. How did you kind of walk that line in some of the settings you've been in?
I think we have to remember who we work for. And I know this sounds really hard, but
Mm.
there's a lot of people in your church and in your ministry, and their goal for that ministry is to accomplish their personal agenda. Uh, and so, as a leader, it's great to differentiate the people's agenda or the people's preferences versus the calling of God on our life.
Mm.
And so, you talk about the trendiest and the coolest. Listen, that may be the desire of some people. And it's okay if you're doing those things, as long as the main thing is the main thing. And
Mm.
so throughout my 20 plus years of ministry, man, that is what I believe God has blessed the most. And that is our willingness to say, okay, these are our preferences over here, but these are God's goals for in instructions for our life. And so we've prioritized the God things over the people things. We work for him, not for them.
Mm. Wow, great word. Now, as a pastor, you've prioritized evangelism the same way you did as a youth pastor. In fact, probably more so, because you got a little more authority now than you did maybe in those other positions. But you've always been known for seeing a lot of folks coming to young people, young men and women. And Jordan, the thing I love is watching your family. To me, your family, I'm talking about the Easley family, right? Is the way a family's supposed to be. I know no family's perfect, and I'm Mr. Dysfunction, and all the broken homes, all the nonsense. Uh, so I always have watched families, and to watch your relationship with your brother. I don't know your sister as well, but certainly got to know you and your brother. Both of you passionate about making a difference for the things of God. But then also, I've watched you go. You've even served uh, with your father. In fact, and this is now your second location. And what's that like? And but what a message it sends, I think, of what the family could be, should be, and yet to watch you both and he's so proud of you and realizes, man, here's what my lane is over here now at this stage of my life. I mean, it's just a beautiful thing to watch.
It is. Jay, you mentioned my resume and all the incredible pastors and leaders that I've had the privilege of working alongside. But man, when you back it up even further than that, my dad was my first pastor, and is still my pastor today,
Hmm.
in a lot of different ways. And so, for the first 18 years living under his roof, he shepherded me and discipled me. And I learned how to share the gospel by going to visitation visits with him on Monday nights back in the day. He would be like, "Hey, just sit down, shut up, don't say anything, just let me do the talking." But man, I wasn't there just to not talk. I was there to observe. And so he's been coaching me up a long time. And so now to be able to fast forward to this season that we're currently living in, we are in a unique place where we have the privilege of serving together, which has been a pretty phenomenal thing. We're writing books together, we're doing speaking engagements together. But now my dad is actually on my staff, which is a great thing for you kids out there. I'm just telling you, it's a great time to get him back for some
Boy, I
things. But
started to say, man, that's great.
but
That's
no, his office is right on the other side of this bookshelf. And so having my dad right here, who pastored great churches for 31 years, and being able to tap into his wisdom, a man who's already walked every single path that I'm currently walking right now, it is a huge benefit to me. But listen, it's also a great benefit to our church. And my dad's been able to help endear me to our church family very quickly. He's our teaching pastor over evangelism. He leads our deacon ministry. I mean, he does a lot of different things. He coaches up our young staff, our young pastors. He does a theological power lunch once a month where we get to tackle some of the big issues. He's been a professor at Union University, and so he
right.
dives
I knew that.
really, really
Yeah.
deep. And but he's just discipling a lot of people. And so just with his experience and his availability to me, I believe it's made me a better pastor. I learned that from Dr. Young. Dr. Young had somebody on his staff named Dr. Deloach, and I know you
Boy,
know
big
Dr.
time. I
Deloach.
do.
Dr. Deloach is now passed, but he was an elder in Dr. Young's life, somebody he respected and had all kinds of wisdom.
Hmm.
And even though Dr. Young was 80 years old at the time that I was serving with him, he had Dr. Deloach, who was 10 years ahead of him, in the office next door, because he knew I need somebody who's been here longer than me doing things differently than me,
Wow.
because having wisdom that close, it's a benefit to the office of the senior pastor.
I believe, boy, great insight, and thanks for, man, I 20 memories just flashed through my head when you brought up that name, and what a great example. Jordan, it says volumes about young men, younger women. There really is some great wisdom to highly esteem your elders, and they're not perfect and they're not infallible. And the ones worth following, they know that better than anybody. They've never been deceived about that. They know, hey man, I'm doing the best I can here. Here's what I tried. Maybe you ought to try it. I wonder what it was like for you and your dad to write the book Resuscitating Evangelism. And I never will forget, I knew you were slick. I knew you were sharp, but that marketing idea, I don't know who came up with it. May have been your dad. I don't know, but it kind of had you all over. But there was that stethoscope that came along with the book. And so immediately you understood exactly the premise. We've got to resuscitate, we got to breathe life back into evangelism, which simply means just sharing the good news. Tell me about that book. What was that like doing it with your dad?
It was a great experience. It really was. There's 8 chapters in the book, and originally it was going to be he's going to write 4, I'm going to write 4. I will say that he only wrote 3, and so you can do the math on the rest of the work. But it
Mhm.
was an awesome project where we really got to just flesh out the idea of what it is to prioritize the things that Jesus tells us to prioritize. And when you look at the trajectory of evangelism, not only in our denomination, but across the board for churches today, no one has a trajectory that is upward ticking right now in the area of lives being changed by Jesus. Baptisms are down. salvation's down. Everything you see in the church is down when it comes to people being saved. And that ought to be alarming to
Yes.
us as believers. And if we're not alarmed, if we're not upset by that, if we're not moved to action when you read the reports, then something's wrong. And so
Mm.
that was the idea of resuscitating evangelism. Before we wrote the book, I literally had to spell check that like 3 or 4 times. But when you think about it, we got to resuscitate it. We got to wake it back up. Somebody needs to get the paddles out and shock the church and remind us what our job is on planet Earth. And so, as being reminded of the Great Commission and also telling some practical stories and some giving some funny illustrations,
Yeah,
I believe that
I
it's
thought
it's a
that was
resource
very
that's easy.
effective. The illustrations, you felt like you were sitting in that room listening to that conversation, and some of the humor I thought was really refreshing. Maybe it's because I'm a little weird and I like to laugh and but it just was such a fresh. It was kind of a live look. If you're going to talk about resuscitating, you might as well do it with a lot of life, and that's what came through in the book. So I want to congratulate both of you on that. We're working on some courses at Charleston Southern University for those that are very serious about getting their youth ministry either major or minor. And that's one of the books that I have targeted that ought to be recommended to all of our students, because I believe whatever role you're going to do, volunteer or full-time or part-time, no matter where the Lord will lead you, like where Jordan is today, he's senior pastor. I started out reaching students. I spent my whole life reaching students. And one thing I want to bring up, Jordan, and ask you about it, and I've never brought this up before really, on any kind of setting like what we're doing. But there was a time in my life I got a little weary of being the youth guy.
Mm.
My buddies were mega church pastors, uh, professors, my peers, those that we'd been doing life with, and we had this great relationship. But I was the guy that people brought in to reach a bunch of students. And, I spoke in high schools all day, every day, which is a very unique niche, and that gave me hundreds of opportunities and some open doors that I probably would have never had. But I got weird. Every time a publisher wanted me to write, it was about a youth issue. I edited 3 Bibles. I'm very pumped. All 3 of them were student Bibles. The Transformer Bible, the Student Leadership Bible, and then got to play a very significant role in the True Love Waits Bible. So, but I was the youth guy, and I'd write
Mm.
books. It'd be on the family, or why good kids do bad things, or drugs and drinking, or dealing with the 8 greatest challenges the family. So I looked up and I just said, man, I don't want to just be the youth guy. I want to be, I was getting to speak at the Air Force Academy or NASA and some pretty cool things, but still I was the youth guy. And I never will forget, my wife said to me, you got to help me understand something. Everything you're getting to do, all these opportunities, is because you've spent your life with young people. And so why don't you just embrace it and say, Lord, you're large and in charge. That was a line I always used. She kind of used it on me. But I got a real rebuke that said, you know what, man, don't ever deny who you are, and don't ever try to put something, in the corner. So I didn't know if you'd ever gone through anything like that, but just listening to you today, I don't think you have, because you're still love students, still care about how evangelism is going with students, and plus your new book coming out, uh, it kind of shows where your heart really is on
Well,
the.
God never really calls you out of student ministry. I think when He calls you into student ministry, um, you're always going to have something inside of your heart that really wants to see that ministry succeed, and you want to see students reach for Christ. I
Yes.
do remember having that same conversation going on in my mind, and it was right when I turned 30, and I'd been in youth ministry for 8 or 9 years at that time. And I can just remember thinking, man, I'm starting to get gray hairs. My kids are in elementary school. I'm turning 30. And you start to think about the shelf life of a youth pastor. And I'll never forget, I was at Second Houston at the time. We had what many consider to be an incredible ministry, especially during that season that God allowed me to serve there. But we had just taken a little over 4,000 students to camp that year,
Mm.
and I was tired. It was end of July, and I can remember thinking, I can't do this. I'm getting too old for this. I got to do something different. I was getting opportunities to preach other places. I was getting phone calls from search committees from churches, and I start having this conversation. And I'll never forget. I'm having lunch with a guy named Steve Seelig. Do you know? You remember
Oh, of
Steve
course.
Seelig
Yeah.
from Second? He's
Yes.
gone to be with the Lord now, but he was a great
Mm.
friend and mentor in my life during that season. And he looked at me in that moment and said this. He said, "Jordan, you have to decide what voice you're going to listen to." He said, "You can listen to the voice of the devil that is communicated through the pride of your heart, or you can listen to the voice that points you to the calling of God on your life in this season." He said, "You won't always be a student pastor, but God's called you to be one right now. And He's called you to be maximized in this moment for the glory of God." And you know what? Looking back on that, is probably the greatest conversation that we ever had.
Wow.
Because I didn't allow the devil to take me out of God's will. I mean, that was where he had me. That's where he called me. That's where he was using me. And I stayed as long as I felt that and knew that in my heart. Um, God also makes it very clear when it's time to go. I prayed a prayer every day of my youth ministry career, and that is, God, if you want me to walk through a door, make it so wide that I can't miss it. And God, if you close a door, give me the courage to go another direction. And so,
Amen.
I always want to do what God wants me to do. And even when the devil was whispering, "Hey, you could do something different, you could do this," looking back, I'm like, man, I sure am glad I stayed where God had me, because we got to experience some things in that season that I
Wow.
have never been able to experience since. And so I'm grateful for that conversation.
Powerful, powerful word. Well, Jordan, I've got to hear more about the new book coming out the end of March.
Mm.
And so we want everyone to kind of know it's coming, uh, kind of prepare yourself. And I know there's a lot of books that are coming. You never, I mean, it's kind of hard to keep up. But anybody serious about youth ministry, tell us about the cheat sheet. What a name, by the way. The cheat sheet for youth pastors. Is that what's the title exactly?
Yeah, it's called Cheat Sheet for Student Ministry.
Okay.
And this book is written for anybody who's involved in student ministry, youth pastors, youth workers, even moms and dads. But the idea for this book was this: after I got out of youth ministry, I just started journaling, and I started writing down all the things that God taught me during that season of student ministry. And we served at some great churches, and we had big staffs and we had small staffs. We had huge budgets, and we had very small budgets, in the different places that God allowed us to serve.
Mm.
And so, after reviewing all of that for 12 years, as I entered into a season where I was a senior pastor, I just started keeping a journal, and I ended up writing down 75 things that the Lord taught us on that journey. And so one day I just woke up and I was like, man, I could distribute this information and really make a difference, because there's some people that are just getting started in youth ministry who don't know this stuff yet. They haven't walked the same path. They haven't lived the same story. And so I started writing it in book form. And the idea of cheat sheet came from just reflecting on my high school years. And I can remember saying, the test is always a lot easier when I have the answers to the test on a cheat sheet, right? I mean, when you have the
I can
answers and
neither
then you
confirm nor deny any allegation. So go ahead.
so it's a lot easier to take the test when you have the answers. And so the same concept, if somebody's just getting into youth ministry, or maybe they've only been in it for a handful of years, hopefully there's something in this book that could almost be like having a cheat sheet, so they're prepared for the moment that they're about to walk through. And so I've taken the opportunity to collaborate in this project with about 50 youth pastors from across the country who I respect, and giving
Mm.
them a chance to give personal testimonies to these 75 things. And through their collaboration and really the grace of God, we were able to put together this project, and it'll be available at the very latest April the 1st, but it should be at the end of March. and should be available on Amazon. And man, I hope it's a great resource for student ministry for a long time. It's not dated. It's just simple, basic stuff that hopefully will make a
It's not
huge difference.
based on the latest stat. It's based
No, no, no,
on,
no.
and you used a phrase, Jordan, that kind of the reason we started Student Leadership University 25 years ago was I walked away from the Air Force Academy, some of the best and brightest on the planet, and realized that many of them were struggling. And if the best and brightest were struggling with some of the key issues of life, conduct, uh, you don't want to act in a way unbecoming to an officer or a gentleman, and then the honor code. And, there were some real challenges going on, like there was in every segment of society with that age group. There was just this shaking going on. But I walked away saying, I want to give students, instead of spending my time with 40-year-olds and these various corporate events and other things, leadership wise, time management, team building, vision, all those kind of things, which I greatly loved and benefit from being able to go into those places and learning from them. But I wanted to give ninth graders, 10th graders, 11th, 12th graders about a 20-year head start.
Hmm.
I wanted to share with them the very things that corporations were spending collectively billions of dollars to train their employees on how to get along and how to be honest and how to manage your time and how to, exceed expectation, on and on it would go. So when I heard you and heard about this book, that flashed into my mind, because you're saying, I walked away. Now you're still involved, but in essence, when you became the senior pastor of where your last two churches, very significant opportunities and very demanding. But you said, I want a youth pastor to know when they're just starting, or that volunteer or that teacher, what it took me 10, 12, 14 years to learn. So I love the idea. I think it's inspired, since it sounds like something I tried to do. But in all seriousness, I love that idea, that cheat sheet that in essence says, hey, let me save you 12 years of banging your head against the, the wall, or drilling some dry holes or dry. I mean, you talk about some great successes, but you also talk about some times when the wheels were coming off a little bit. So
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
love the concept and love the idea.
Thanks, Jay.
What's the greatest, what would you say to a youth pastor right now that's discouraged and wondering, is this what I'm supposed to do? Or Lord, does anybody know what I got to go through down here? Those moments, and we all have them, but what would you say to them heart to heart?
Man, if you're wondering what you're supposed to do next, and you're in the middle of one of those seasons, I would say you have to just hit the pause button and remember your calling. That's the one thing that I believe allows a pastor to wake up on Monday and not quit. You have to remember your calling. You have to remember why you do what you do, and you have to remember the who and who you're supposed to reach. You have to remember the whole thing, the whole concept of God calls men and women into ministry to lead people, to equip people for the work of ministry, and to live out the Great Commission in a great way. And if we don't do it, who's going to do it? I mean, they're not going to do it in Washington. They're not going to do it, down the street. God's called you to do that. And if you don't reach your community for Christ, who's going to reach it? If you don't lead your student ministry to be evangelistic on their campus, who's going to do it? And so I think by asking the question, okay, God, how am I going to be maximized for the kingdom of God and for the glory of God right now? Uh, and you remember your calling of God, and you remember where your power comes from through that calling, then you have no excuses. All of us are going to walk through difficult seasons. All of us are going to hit that circumstance that makes us want to quit. But when
Mm.
you reflect on the fact that God called you to lead and to live in this season and through this season, then it takes all the excuses off the table. It's kind of like what we talked about to begin with. You have to reimagine the path of how you're going to accomplish what God called you to accomplish, even when things get tough. And when you make up your mind that that's going to happen, then it eliminates the circumstantial things that would, in essence, create the desire to quit. And
Wow.
so, you have to be encouraged when you remember God's calling. If God's calling doesn't encourage you to move forward today, then you might not be called into ministry in the first place, you know?
Great word. I also love that we ought to celebrate victories. And there are young men and young women and volunteers and adults that under our ministry have thrived and grown and gone on to do amazing things. And that's one of the most fulfilling things in the world for those in leadership. When you see fruit that's out there
Hmm.
that has remained, and you watch that young couple going through some real challenges, maybe with the health of a child or a challenge that life brings, all the things that so many of us are facing, and you watch, and so to me, I always try to get everybody to celebrate the victories. Make a big deal out of this, and way to go, and remind yourself, rehearse how God's used you in the past when you
Yeah,
feel like I'm in kind of a dry spot right now.
yeah,
One last
that's good.
question, Jordan. One last question to you. When you look for a youth pastor, that's got to be an interesting process, all right? Because uh, strengths, weaknesses. You've seen a lot. You've been around. What somebody did for you or asked you. So I'm just curious, with all your background and experience, and plus you're in a place where the greatest thing you can do for your church is to reach their children and their grandchildren. I mean, the greatest
Sure.
thing I can do for somebody is bless their children, try to encourage their children. But what goes through your mind is a young person thinking about, how do I prepare myself, or what kind of person do I want to be? What in your mind are some characteristics that you look for?
That's a great question, Jay. This could be another hour, just addressing this question because it's so important, especially being a pastor that was a youth pastor. That is such a critical thing. There's a lot of pastors out here leading churches, great churches, who've never been an age group person.
Hmm.
They rolled out of seminary and took a church and just started preaching on Sundays, and they've never been in the shoes of the youth pastor. They've never been in the shoes of an age group person, and I personally believe that can be a hindrance in ministry. I think when you have that experience of walking in the shoes of the people on your staff, it gives you a certain perspective that is beneficial as a leader. And so, I don't know if my youth pastor would say that same thing, but I believe that. But in hiring a youth pastor, there are certain characteristics that I believe are absolutely critical. And first and foremost, they have to be a Great Commission person, not part of the Great Commission. They have to be a Great Commission person. There's a lot of people who, man, they say, I'm a discipleship guy, and what that means to me as a pastor, it's like code words saying I want to sit in coffee shops knee to knee with the same believer every single week, and we're going to become really good friends, and we're going to memorize a bunch of scripture, and we're going to see absolutely no fruit in my life. No, that's totally off the rails, and I understand that, but you have to understand the Great Commission's more than that. Like, I want to do all those things as well with my Christian friends, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't move us to action, to fish for people and to meet people at their point of need with the gospel, then we're
Right.
missing the Great Commission. And so in interviewing people, if you tell me that that's your passion and you want to pour into the same handful of kids, you're not going to be on our staff as a youth pastor, because you have to have the desire in your heart to accomplish what Jesus said your main job is to accomplish. And that's the whole Great Commission. And so that's what I believe. I believe discipleship is a combination of evangelism and discipleship, which leads to more evangelism. And if it doesn't, then I think you're getting it wrong. And so that's the first and foremost thing that I would address. Are you a Great Commission person? Number two, I would say, how does this person fit the culture of my community and my church? You have to know who you are, you have to know who you're trying to reach, And you have to make sure that the person that you recognize as God's called person for that position is going to maximize your ministry in great ways. You can't do that if you get somebody that doesn't fit the culture. You can't do that if somebody doesn't fit the church. You can't do that if somebody doesn't fit the pastor and the staff team that they're leading alongside. Somebody told me a long time ago, never hire somebody as one of your pastors that you wouldn't want to personally spend an hour with at lunch every single week. And so that's a big deal to me. I'm going to make sure that if I hire you on our
Mm.
staff, that you fit the culture of our church staff, because we're doing life together. We operate very closely together. We are moving forward as a family unit, and we spend a lot of time together. So if you don't fit the culture of our staff, our church, our community, you're not going to be on our staff. The third thing I look at is the family. I want to see how you function as a father, as a husband. I want to see
Mm.
how you interact with your wife. I want to see if you're holding her hand or if you're sitting 3 feet from her at the dinner table. I want to see, is this a person that is leading his family well? Let me just say it this way. If you aren't leading your family well, you're not going to lead your ministry well. And if you're not going to lead your ministry well, you're not going to be on our staff. And so as far as hiring, I think the family thing is a big deal.
Wow.
Right now I have 2 kids in our student ministry. I have a 14-year-old son, a 15-year-old daughter. And
Wow.
you talk about a tough gig, because not only am I a part of the hiring process for our youth pastors, but now I have 2 kids in your ministry, and it's more important to me than ever that we have the very best youth pastor in the country. And
Wow.
so our guys are phenomenal. But it's important if your kids are in the ministry or not. If you're the pastor
I
hiring a
agree.
youth pastor, man, don't settle. It And this makes us sound terrible, but we interviewed, before we hired our last youth pastor, we interviewed 34 people for that position before we pulled the trigger. We spent a lot of money on plane tickets, and we spent a lot of time interviewing and hosting people and
Wow.
putting them up in hotels. There were 34. He was number 34. And people were like, what is taking you so long? And that was my answer. We're not going to settle. We're going to make sure that the family that we bring into this role, number one, we believe they are 100% called by God for this season to be in this position. But number
Wow.
two, we're going to make sure that they check every single box. And if they don't check every single box, that should be affirmation to us that they're not the person that God's calling for this position. And
Wow.
so, man, it's a process every single time, but I can't think of something that's more important, because in so many different ways, as goes the student ministry, as goes the
Agree.
church.
Wow.
And so it's an important thing to me. It ought to be an important thing to every single one of our churches when we start to reflect on the decisions that are being made for Christ, when we start talking about the growth engine of the church, when we start talking about passion, when we talk about potential, man, all those things start with youth ministry. Every great move of God that I can think of right now, it started with teenagers and
100%
young
right.
people. And so if that's the case in church history, why wouldn't we put a huge emphasis on the next generation? Because I personally believe if we're going to experience another great awakening in our country, it's going to start with people younger than us, Jay. And if that's the case, then let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's hire the very best,
Hmm.
and let's not settle, and make student ministry the stepchild of our church staff. But let's treat it like, I believe the Lord wants us to treat it, and that is to emphasize that ministry, because it's such critical years in the life of a person.
Wow, Jordan, such great insight, wisdom, and honesty. And I'm very, very grateful. And I know our listeners are. Jordan, when we started student leadership, the number one argument that I had more, and I was a guy that spent my life with youth pastors and was their friend and known by many of them. But I began to get a lot of blowback because we're not interested in raising up leaders. We want followers. We want followers. And I'm going, well, the word disciple means to be disciplined and to be a learner. And the word leader is simply an influencer. So I don't know what kind of disciples we're making if they're not able, if that young lady who's a cheerleader the cheerleading team is not different because she's on the squad, then we haven't done a very good job with discipleship or leadership. I mean, so to me, it was never either or, but yet so
Hmm.
many folks would want to pigeonhole it. I love the way you talk about the Great Commission. Oh no, we're into discipleship. And there's really, you can't slide a credit card between the two if we do it right. So I
Sure.
want our students to be disciplined. I want them to know the word. I want them to be prepared. Future belongs to those that are prepared. But yet I also want them, because I'm on that team or you're on in the band, you work with at that Chick-fil-A unit, where you work. I just think because you're there, your family ought to be different. Because you're there, your friends and your teammates and your associates ought to be different. So that's, to me, I had to go through that argument over and over again. And as you broke down the difference between Great Commission and discipleship, we I believe you laid it out beautifully. So I want to thank you. Jordan Easley, it's no wonder God has used you in such a significant way. And
Mm.
I'm so very, very grateful for your ministry. I'm grateful to be honest with you, at every stage. I've been privileged to know you at almost every one of those locations, and it's just been refreshing, exciting, and I'm grateful for your willingness to be a voice for those that are serious about preparing themselves to fulfill the highest calling and highest vision on the planet, and that's making a difference for young people. The new book coming out the end of March, early April. This isn't an April Fool's joke. This is a reality, a cheat sheet for student ministry. And what an opportunity for you to learn. And plus, not only are you learning from Jordan, you're learning from those other 50 youth pastors. And knowing Jordan like I do, I can just imagine the wide variety and the differences that go into all those different youth ministries to get their comment, get their feedback, and get their advice. So you're really learning from a village, if you will, of folks passionate. So what an opportunity for us to get that 20-year head start. So I want you to check it out. And Jordan, I promise you, we're going to be requiring some students that are serious about that training, reading that book. Thank you,
That's
buddy.
great. Jay, thanks for the opportunity, man. It's great to be a part of your podcast. It's also been fun to look backwards. It's kind of fun because I think back to when I was 16 years old, going to Orlando to SLU 101 and thinking
Wow.
about how that was a part of my launch pad. And
Mm.
now this summer, check this out, man. I'm sending both of my kids to
Man,
101 in Orlando. How does that make you feel, buddy?
it makes me feel pretty good, to be honest with you. Somebody said, "How long are you going to keep speaking to students?" I said, "Listen, I don't want to be the old guy they're going, who's that old guy up there?" But as long as they listen and as long as they feel I've got something to say, I can't think of a higher calling than to help raise up the next generation of leaders. And of course, Jordan, the joy of bringing certain people along with you. And then all of a sudden that light goes off and you go, goodness gracious, this is a world-class leader. And it's not just a helper. You talked about Brent Crow, and
Mhm.
this unique individual. So it's pretty exciting. Jeff Wallace, and in our team, we have a phenomenal team. So I know the joy of watching folks come along in your ministry, and then to see them being able to serve. And then you look at them and you go, oh my goodness, I should have treated them a lot better when they were, in that role. Just look at them now, So it's very fulfilling, as you know. So thank you, Jordan, for everything. Thank you for being a leader, and thank you for the way you reach out to your peers. There's some close networks going on and fellowships going on, and I like it when we do life together. Uh,
Yeah.
it's pretty exciting. So, a lot to talk to you about in the future. Thank you for your time. Most of all, thank you for your incredible ministry.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy. Great job.